Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The competence of the Imperial Stormtrooper is probably one of the most divisive topics in Star Wars lore. And this discussion really starts from the very first film when old Ben Kenobi, talks about that ambush on the Jawa Sandcrawler.
And these blast points, too accurate for sand people. Only Imperial Stormtroopers are so precise.
Now, those words are directly contradicted by the actions of the Stormtroopers on board the Death Star when they're trying to hunt down Luke and company.
It's them! Blast them!
Get back to the ship! Where are you going? Come back!
Certainly has courage.
Good will it do us if he gets himself killed?
That's not just incompetence, it's clear cowardice. Or are they just more afraid of Tarkin and Vader, who have their own plan up their sleeves?
Are they away?
They've just made the jump into hyperspace.
You're sure the homing beacon is secure aboard their ship? I'm taking an awful risk, Vader. This had better work.
But then what explains the lack of marksmanship from all those stormtroopers when Luke and company first try to escape Mos Eisley?
Stop that ship! Blast them!
Well, instead of just spending an entire video breaking down the accuracy and tactics of individual units of stormtroopers, which would be a lot of fun, I think it's far more beneficial to perform a root cause analysis on why Imperial stormtroopers are like this rather than talk about their symptoms, like why they have such poor aim. Too often in politics and in society, our leaders try to focus on surface level issues because they're more visible and they're easier to tackle rather than fixing the root of the problems that cause a lot of these surface issues. It's like taking cough drops instead of antibiotics when you have a respiratory bacterial infection. Not a good idea. When assessing any military force, whether they are fictional or they are real, there are many things we can take a look at. The most obvious is combat power or hard capabilities, which include manpower, firepower, logistical capabilities, and technology. The Empire performs relatively well in these categories, especially compared to their opponents, a bunch of poorly equipped and trained insurgents. Of course, all throughout human history, from the American Revolution to Vietnam to the German Mud Wizard incident, numerically superior and technologically and resource-rich forces have always been defeated by forces with limited hard capabilities. And that's because combat power is just one small piece of the overall pie of what makes a military force efficient. Another thing we could take a look at is the command and control of a military force. How is the Imperial military structured? Are lower level soldiers given a lot of autonomy? Are there junior officers and NCOs that can make decisions at the small unit level? Or is this a top-down hierarchy where command is far more centralized and filtered from top down? And so only at platoon or company levels do we actually have real-time decision-making capabilities. Also, how competent are the communication systems and information systems on the battlefield used by soldiers to figure out what is going on? The Empire definitely seems to favor a top-down hierarchy, but there's also evidence of a pretty solid NCO corps, most likely inherited from the Republic era, that perhaps is the true backbone of the Imperial military. Now, perhaps one of the most important factors when assessing a military force is the doctrine and training, the blueprint for how a military is created, fights, and is organized. This is what I really want to focus on today, and that's because the Stormtrooper Corps has one very large, glaring issue when it comes to their training. The Stormtroopers were considered an elite fighting force in every way, especially during the early Empire period. Candidates were selected from a pretty young age and diverted from the Imperial Academy pipeline based on psychological profile and physical abilities. In those early days, the Stormtrooper Corps was far smaller than the regular Imperial Army and Imperial Navy and infantry trooper units, and was considered an expeditionary unit or specialized light infantry. Think Army Rangers or United States Marine Corps. This meant that the Stormtroopers were afforded a much higher level of training than Imperial Army troopers and naval troopers. Far more resources were devoted to state-of-the-art training facilities like that base on Daro that we see in the Bad Batch for the precursor of the Stormtroopers, the TK troopers. In this way, the Stormtroopers actually have similar access to resources to the clone troopers that preceded them, but there is one major difference, and that is the sheer amount of time spent on indoctrinating stormtroopers. While Imperial Army and Navy forces can be seen as more loyal to the Empire and its people, the Imperial Army specifically had more loyalty to local regions and sectors because many of the recruits were from former Planetary Defense Force fighters. The Stormtrooper Corps was really directly loyal to the Emperor and his enforcer Darth Vader. The indoctrination they went under was designed to manufacture obedience and also eliminate the individuality of the average soldier, and perhaps most importantly, indoctrinated them into the worldview of Darth Sidious. And so from Kurita to Arcanus to Lothal, every Imperial Stormtrooper Academy, a huge amount of the training was really focused on political history, political indoctrination, and reading Palpatine's speeches and ideology. Those are designed to slowly replace their worldviews, their personality and morality with one that made them ideal for enforcing the ideas of Palpatine and asking less questions. It also helped that the majority of Stormtrooper recruits, at least in those early years, came from the Outer Rim. Many of these planets were devastated by the Clone Wars.
With the Empire, I get paid, I get fed, and I have a roof over my head. That's more than the Republic ever did for me.
And so these recruits came from impoverished, resource-starved, and undereducated communities in the Outer Rim that were basically cut off from the larger galaxy. And so for many, joining the Empire was really their ticket off planet into a brighter future.
And if these new droids do work out, I want to transmit my application to the Academy this year.
You mean the next semester before the harvest?
Sure, there's more than enough droids.
The Empire took advantage of this vulnerability, and it only made these recruits more susceptible to the indoctrination. The Stormtroopers attended daily classes educating their ranks about the corruption of the Republic and their Jedi Guardians, and how democracy and liberalization had led to corporate overreach and exploitation of the hard-working people in the galaxy. Now, there's truth to a lot of these lessons, but what Palpatine conveniently leaves out is that he's the one who orchestrated the entire thing. These lessons were combined with a Sith-like culture that was cynical about the concept of morality and created a hyper-competitive and toxic environment where might is right. The Empire went to great lengths to remove the conscience of the average soldier, focusing training on loyalty and obedience and a sense of duty over actively thinking about one's actions. The only people who really thought were officers, and these individuals underwent even more indoctrination and screening. This destruction of one's identity was further reinforced by the removal of the names of the average trooper, which were replaced by numbers, and the complete concealment of their face and body with Stormtrooper armor and helmets that made them robotic and uniform in nature. Now, why was the Empire so obsessed with indoctrinating their most elite shock troopers? Well, at its core, the Sith ideology that drove Emperor Palpatine was really just focused on, amassing power for Palpatine. If we take a look at Emperor Palpatine's contingency plan and Operation Cinder, it's very clear that Palpatine didn't really care at all about even his most loyal Imperial subjects. At the end of the day, everything in the Empire was built to serve him, and as such, Palpatine, like most despots, with this kind of mentality, feared his own populace. He feared that they would learn the truth, and so organizations like the Stormtrooper Corps were an insurance policy to protect him in case he begins to lose his grasp on power. Many dictators in our own world have similar forces. Think Hitler's SA and later on the SS, or Saddam Hussein's Fedayeen, or Republican Guard. Indoctrination was so pervasive among Stormtrooper units that I would argue that it deeply affected their combat capabilities. The indoctrination wasn't only done during training, it was maintained during deployment, especially in the latter years of the war when everything was falling apart. The ISB famously devoted a huge amount of resources to monitoring the chatter of Stormtrooper comms during missions. Stormtroopers were discouraged from having idle chatter while on deployment and on patrol, but they were also discouraged from knowing each other outside of work hours. Oftentimes, the men and women in uniform knew very little about their comrades. Although, of course, on certain longer deployments in more remote areas where they're cut off from central command, I think there was a, relaxation on this rule, along with relaxation in hygiene standards and grooming standards. Now, these type of restrictions obviously cause problems for unit cohesion and the combat effectiveness of a unit. It's perhaps for this reason we oftentimes see Stormtrooper units use relatively simple frontal attack tactics with very little tactical flexibility or creativity, leading to heavy casualties and waste of resources. This is what happens when there's no communication amongst your units and really all the power is just devoted to one individual. I mean, how do you separate your force into smaller groups if no one is allowed to have any kind of autonomy? Now, before the modernization of the People's Liberation Army in China in the 1990s, it was quite common for an infantry unit to only have one radio per platoon. The People's Liberation Army is not a national army in the traditional sense that it serves the people. it is the official army of the Chinese Communist Party. It really is designed to serve the party first. As such, in the past, the officer corps was full of political appointees, many of whom lacked military experience or just basic knowledge like how to read topographic maps. In 1979, during the Sino-Vietnamese War, a large Chinese contingent of 200,000 troops invaded northern Vietnam in response to Vietnam's invasion and occupation of Cambodia, an ally to China at the time. The Chinese deployed tanks and regular army soldiers against a much smaller force of Vietnamese militia and border units and failed to make any real incursions into North Vietnam. This is a very embarrassing moment for the PLA, but it also exposed fundamental and structural weaknesses with the Chinese military. And that's led to, decades-long attempt to reform the military, which is ongoing today. Another huge problem with the Stormtroopers' indoctrination is that it took time. Regular classes on why Palpatine was awesome and why Copnor brought peace and stability to the galaxy only reinforces the loyalty of the men, which in practical terms doesn't really increase their combat capabilities. Time spent studying political literature or Palpatine's old speeches is probably better spent learning small unit tactics or just doing something as simple as bonding and training with your squad mates and developing unit cohesion. But of course, dictators who are desperately trying to maintain power oftentimes handicap their own military forces to prevent an internal uprising within the military. Now, interestingly enough, when Hitler established the Nazi regime, he needed a military that was not only loyal to him, but also extremely capable, as Germany during World War II pretty much took on all of its neighbors at one point, aside from Mussolini's Italy. So if we took a look at the German military in 1938, political indoctrination became mandatory. But this was only in the form of maybe 1 to 2 hours of study per week, and during deployment that number would drop even more. It's probably annoying and it wasted time, but 1 to 2 hours is not nearly as bad as having one entire day a week devoted to indoctrination in political history. Now, consequently, as the war turned against Germany from 1943 and on, ideological refreshers and indoctrination training was ramped up significantly, even for regular German army units. But by and large, the German military was pretty professional and capable until the very end of the war, when they were just, a skeleton of their former self. And that again is because of their very professional military training standards, which was focused on actually waging war and not just on political indoctrination. Although it should be noted that the SS units were definitely far more indoctrinated, but also quite effective as well. There are always exceptions to the rule. We should also mention that German society, for better or worse, was pretty united behind Hitler because of all the hardships they suffered in the decade leading up to the war, post World War I, where they were heavily punished by the Versailles Treaty. Now, if we compare that to the PLA, which for now, in all intents and purposes, is focused on China's security and not necessarily invading other countries, I hope, we see a military force that places a huge emphasis on political teachings and ideological training. There might be a cultural aspect here that we can study, just like how we should definitely study Germans' culture and how that led to fascism. But basically, even in 2024, after huge structural reforms in the Chinese military, all PLA personnel still need to devote a massive time to listening to indoctrination. That includes reading party material, listening to Chinese President Xi Jinping's political speeches. If you take a look at the PLA's guidelines today, for combat units, I think it's 40% of their training is devoted to political indoctrination. That's a lot of time not spent on actually fighting wars or learning how to fight wars. In theory, this means that the PLA has much more committed and dedicated personnel, but one could argue that that time is much better spent actually training them to fight for war. I don't think the PLA could sustain the same type of mass wave attacks that they did during the Korean War because, let's be honest, their entire military is made up of only children. And so actually the PLA is in a very similar situation to what the Imperial Stormtroopers underwent. Although I would say that the Stormtroopers training is even more intense. And it's clear that the indoctrination of Stormtroopers definitely harmed their combat capabilities. The Stormtrooper Corps was designed as a vanguard unit for a conventional army. They were designed to fight near-peer adversaries in the open on large battlefields, similar to what the clone troopers went through during the Clone Wars, but as the Galactic Civil War grew in intensity, the Stormtroopers really needed more training in counterinsurgency, especially after the PRD initiative, when Stormtroopers began to be deployed en masse and replaced Imperial Army units. There was also a huge influx of new recruits, and let's be honest, standards had dropped considerably. But as happened with the German army, instead of focusing more resources on training, the Empire focused more resources on indoctrination, which of course is the wrong move. And so this might be one of the major reasons why in Rebels and in the original trilogy, Stormtrooper units are pretty incompetent. They just don't have that much training. They spend too much time being forced to be loyal. By the Battle of Endor, the Stormtrooper Corps was elite in name only. You had mass casualty events like the destruction of the Death Star to blame, but also poor and imbalanced training regiment. Now, the Rebel Alliance had a huge advantage in one category when compared to the Empire. Their soldiers were mostly volunteers, and there was no ideological training necessary because most of these soldiers in the Rebel Alliance believed their cause was just. No brainwashing or political history was necessary, as many of these men and women had already lived through the horrors of Imperial rule and were joining the Rebel Alliance in the first place because of that trauma. In the early days of the conflict, it was not uncommon, as we see in Cassian Andor's case, for Rebel troopers to just leave and, go do their own thing and come back and join in a unit later, something that would be unheard of in a more conventional military structure.
You know where I stand. The day I need permission to come and go, I'm gone.
That day is near.
This is a chaotic situation for sure. This is not how you build a military, but it does show us that there's a lot of trust between the Rebel High Command and the enlisted or volunteer soldiers that were fighting beneath them. There's an understanding that if you risk your life for such a cause, there's a certain amount of leniency and flexibility that existed. General George Washington, leader of the Continental Army during the American Revolution against undead vampire king George III, faced similar realities, especially during the winter months of the American Revolution. Although punishment for desertion was enforced, Washington made sure to carefully restrain the cruelty of these actions, as the Continental Army endured great hardship during their service. Colonial forces faced chronic shortages in ammunition, shelter, funding, and food. George Washington chose at Valley Forge in the most difficult months of the Continental Army's campaign against the British to focus on improving morale, training, and discipline rather than outright enforcement of rules and punishment. George Washington understood that in order to fight tyranny and the undead, one must avoid at all costs the lack of empathy that is symptomatic of despots. In my opinion, this is a much better way to ensure the loyalty of men, not through fear, or not only through fear, because fear is important to a certain degree, but through genuine empathy and alignment of values and motivations. I would never want to fight alongside an individual who is forced to fight, or, fearing imprisonment if they don't fight. We see the same type of quality amongst Ukrainian armed forces and the careful relationship that Ukrainian political and military leadership must have with their own forces. While there is definitely a lot of entrenched Soviet-era ideology amongst some of the military command, and also some forced conscription, the war effort in Ukraine is widely supported by the populace. Some of the best units are completely volunteer, and the sheer number of grassroots organizations created by Ukrainian civilians and sympathetic foreigners is a clear sign that Ukrainian society is very supportive of the conflict and behind the soldiers who are defending their cities from daily attacks. There's very little need for political indoctrination when Russia is literally sending hundreds of drones and missiles at Ukrainian population centers on a daily basis. And that, of course, is probably the best way to do things, to create a military force that is aligned with the values of your country and, to only declare war that your military would actually support or your civilian populace would support. That way you can leave the politics to the politicians. That is how you build a proper military force. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.